This feels like a very apt photograph this week. After the storms we've seen pictures of on the news. And I think many of you will know that I grew up in Boston, in Lincolnshire, which is very close to the coast. And in the Middle Ages, it was the third most important port in England. And in the Second World War, it was a jumping off point for bombing flights to Germany. And it was where the dam busters flew from. After the war, it went back to being a reasonably prosperous market town of my childhood. But in the mid-60s, something happened. And I can remember hearing my father railing against a man called Beeching. And so some of you who are a bit older will remember Beeching. You can hear the venom in my voice there. Beeching has nothing to how my father felt. He decided to rationalise the railway system. He closed 4,500 miles of railway line, and he shut 2,128 stations, and effectively cut off vast swathes of the country. We had had a very fast direct line to London, about 2 to 2.5 hours, which meant that it was perfectly possible to get to London very quickly, do a day's work, and return the same day. And it also meant that the freight which came into the port could be quickly transported, as well as the fish that was caught locally. The train went north up to, oh, that seems to jump one, went north up to the New Holland ferry. I used to be quite scared of this because my grandparents lived in a seaside town just north of Hull. But this ferry, the train, literally went right to the water, just as you can see there. And I always thought one day we might just slide straight off into the water. I was quite scared as a little girl at the New Holland ferry. It was long before the Humber Bridge was built, although I'm very pleased to say that my grandfather was a councillor who proposed the building of the Humber Bridge, but that was before the Second World War, and they thought at £3 million it was too expensive. I can't even begin to tell you what it cost eventually. So in those days, you could get straight off the train at the New Holland ferry, into the ferry, and that sailed across to Hull. And that was also very convenient because it actually came in to Paragon Square, which was where the train station was and the shops. So you literally sailed in, and those big buildings you can see there, the train station and an amazing department store called Hammond's, where I used to get my school shoes. From Hull, you could get trains up the rest of the northeast coast. So it was very fast and efficient. Now, axing that railway line from London through Boston up to the New Holland ferry, and then axing lots of stations on the other side of Hull, just as my father predicted, brought poverty to the whole area. It was cut off from the rest of the country. House prices slumped, and they are still cheaper today than anywhere else in the country. International trade dried up completely from Boston. It was just gone. And to this day, if you put a search engine into a journey to the beautiful East Coast seaside resorts like Whitby or Scarborough, you can see it takes more than twice as long to get there on public transport as it does by car. And that's insane. That is actually insane. So I grew up loving the sea, and even now when I see the sea, I can feel myself relax. I have no problem just sitting and looking at it and not doing very much. You can keep the mountains, as far as I'm concerned, the sea isn't a thing. Now, as a family, we would go to places close to home. We could get on our bikes and go to places like Freeston Shore, which I always found captivating. You climbed up the bank, and the bank is on that side of the picture. And instead of, when you climbed up that bank, you could actually see the high tide beating against the flood defences. It was very exciting to see that. And the Plumbers Hotel, which you can see in the picture, stood on the bank at the sea edge. And there are some wonderful pictures of the Plumbers Hotel of Edwardians sitting on the terrace looking down at the sea. But close by was a Borstal camp. And when the government decided to drain the marsh at Freeston Shore, the boys were set to work pushing the sea back. Now, there was one good thing about that. The boys had a little tiny railway, which they transported staff. And because my father worked for the Lincolnshire River Authority, we were allowed on that little tiny railway. That was very exciting. The other thing was we could walk on the reclaimed land and pick samphire to eat for tea. It hadn't been discovered at that time for fine dining. And it's now a delicacy which you'll pay a small fortune for. But we just picked it, my mum cooked it. I can still remember the shock I had the first time I climbed the bank, and instead of sea, there were fields with cows on them, as far as the eyes could see. And you had to walk a long way on a raised path with fields on either side before you found the sea again. And I was always a bit scared of this path because it felt rather like the story of Moses and the path through the Red Sea. And I felt that at any minute, the low fields on either side of me would start to fill with water and the sea would just roll back. I went back a few years ago and climbed the bank again and was surprised to see that some of the water is back. The powers that be had discovered that forcing the sea and the land to do something for which it was not intended was actually creating problems along the coast and was devastating the local environment. So they allowed some of the sea to return and created a bird sanctuary with the RSPB. And I wonder, Dave, if you've ever been to that particular bird sanctuary.
I've heard of it, but not been there.
So today we heard from Sean the story from Genesis of the creation of the earth. And of course, we also now know from science that water was the first thing to appear in the creation of the planet. Because without water, life becomes extant. And it's one of the reasons when scientists send probes to other planets, they're so keen to find signs of water, because water is essential to life. So from Genesis, we know that human beings are there to be God's agents, to name the plants, the animals, and to care for them. Just as in that work that happened at Freeston Shore, when human beings made an error and they needed to rectify it, the ecosystems of the world are equally fragile. Right through the Bible, we can see serious teaching about our responsibilities. Human actions have consequences. So just as the beaching plan of the 1960s was the death knell for some communities and pushed them into continuing poverty, we have to think harder and longer about consequences. Just saving money short term is not always the answer. Now, on the day I was beginning to think about this sermon, there was an item on the news about some elderly men in Scarborough that call themselves the Sons of Neptune. I don't know whether many of you saw that this week. You might see people nodding. Now, they became famous in the 1980s when they entered into a long battle with the authorities about Yorkshire Water's plans to improve quality by building a giant sewer that discharged straight onto the beach at Scarborough. The men were all very keen swimmers and quickly discovered that the sewage was untreated. And if you've ever been to Scarborough, there are two beautiful beaches, but you've probably not been to Scarborough because the railways don't connect any longer. They complained, these men, these sons of Neptune, and they were told by the Prime Minister, or Mrs. Thatcher, that all sewage discharged on the British coast was treated, which it wasn't. And so they set about a series of stunts to prove their point. And Scarborough Council were very angry with them because they said they were putting on holidaymakers. Who would want to go to Scarborough, the beautiful beach, and swim in raw sewage? You wouldn't, would you? It'd be horrible. Now, one stunt they had in 1989 was to sail a giant toilet down the Thames to the House of Parliament. You'll see the name of this toilet was the Thatcher Loo. And they sailed that down the Thames, and these were not disreputable local men. These were senior people from Scarborough. When they got arrested, as inevitably they did near the House of Parliament, they were asked if they wanted their solicitor, and they said, well, actually, our solicitor's in this boat with us, going down the Thames for this giant loo. But in 1991, the European Union took up the issue of clean water, and things began to improve. And in 2001, they really did start treating the sewage. And the good news is that in 2021, the water off Scarborough Beach was declared as being of good quality. So if you've got hours and hours and hours to spend getting to Scarborough, you can swim safely. Now, the reason it was on the news this week is that a film producer is going to make a film about them and their struggles. As they struggled with Mrs. Thatcher and the local authority and Yorkshire Water, who were improving the water, as they tried to protect their environment and particularly the sea. So I think that will be a film well worth watching. I imagine it's going to be quite funny when it actually arrives. Genesis insists that the sea is all part of God's creation. It's not an alien force, although it is a source of great power. We read of what happened when God parted the sea for Moses in the Exodus, and we know of these mythical monsters that emerged from the sea in Daniel chapter 7 and in Revelation, which was an alternative reading for today. We read of a sea of glass like crystal. And the sea is calmed and tamed before the throne of God. But the sea we heard of in the gospel reading was rough and terrifying, even for experienced fishermen like the disciples. They might have been faithful disciples, but when faced with a raging, boiling sea, they were terrified, despite Jesus' calmness and serenity. They were not in a state to remember God's promise to Noah that he would never flood the earth again. They were too scared to recall the sea dividing for Moses. And they don't seem to have learned yet that Jesus was bringing about a new exodus and saving his people. They were not yet aware of his amazing power. But as we got to the end of the passage, as the storm subsides, we can hear that they've become calm and begun to recall the stories and psalms they've learned since they were children. Where is your faith? Jesus asked his disciples. And in fear and amazement, they asked one another, who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. And we know that God can tame the untamable and the uncontrollable. And this week, We saw wind and waves hit our country in a way that no human being could stop. It was not within the power of a human being. We like to be in control. What happens when it's out of control? When the water, the waves, the sea, the wind hits us, that's terrifying because we have no way of stopping it. Remember the words of today's Psalm 65. God, our Saviour, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the furthest seas, who form the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength, who still the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the turmoil of the nations. We've certainly seen some roaring seas and waves this week. And we need to know God's power in our lives. And just as it says there about the turmoil of the nations, we are currently in a place where there is great turmoil in our nations. And we seem to be hovering on the brink of war between Russia and Ukraine. And I've put up a picture here which perhaps indicates how bad it was, and it's got worse since this picture was, I did this picture. You can see that Ukraine is surrounded by the Russians. You can see why they're scared, why what's happening is absolutely terrifying. And whatever happens there will inevitably draw in other countries. So I think that the words of our psalm today have never felt more necessary. And I think we just need to imagine for ourselves how the Ukrainians feel seeing their country surrounded as it is in this map. It's very stark. And the great power that we need is in God's hands. So let's pray. Father God, help us to feel your power in our lives, so that we too can learn to protect your precious world and also to trust in you in the world that seems to mess things up. Let us feel the peace and power that the disciples felt as the storm clouds lifted and the sea became calm. Bring love and calm and peace into our lives and those who are living in great fear in the Ukraine. Amen.